Chapter 12. We'd always depended on Edson's trapping for a greater part of our yearly income. Last year the money had come in handy for the baby and the farm implements. This year I'd vowed to buy a horse. It was embarrassing to have to borrow a horse every time I needed one, and though the PF Company was very generous and kind about loaning us one, it went against my pride. The price of furs fluctuates more than any commodity on the market. This year it was down, and we could only get $1.50 for prime hides. A whole catch wouldn't be worth the price of a horse. So how was I to get it, I wondered. I still clung to the idea, but it didn't promise to be much else. One cold November day I was down on the neighbor's sheep ranch. Wealthy owner had come out in his big Cadillac. It was before cars were enclosed, and what a cold thing they were to ride in. One had to bundle up well and have lots of robes. He had one robe that was especially attracting my attention. It was made out of coyote hides with the heads cut off and the ends butted together. The tails were left on for trimming. I looked the robe over thoroughly, then asked the sheepman, "Who made this for you?" He told me that an Indian had tanned the hides and made the robe, and he told me the Indian's name. I thought, well, if an Indian can make a robe like that, I can too. I lost no time in hunting up the Indian. He was kind enough to give me his recipe for tanning and showed me how to cut the hides, using only a 10-inch strip from the middle of the back for each fur. Then he showed me how to sew them together. I don't remember the recipe now, but I know I soaked the hides in some kind of strong solution, then let them partially dry. After that it was a case of rubbing and patience. You hold the hides in your hands with the insides together and rub and rub. The more you rub, the softer the hide gets. We all joined in the rubbing bee, teacher and all. Every night after supper everyone would get a hide and begin rubbing. Sometimes, to break the monotony, we'd have Edson play a tune on his accordion. She had bought from the sheep herder for $15. It was surprising what a lift music could give us. I was in something of a hurry to get the robe made, for I wanted to sell it during the holidays. When the tanning was finished, I sewed the hides together. This was not a pleasant job, for each time I breathed in, I spit the fur out my mouth in gobs and blew it out my nostrils. But I kept on till it was put together, and then I lined it with a brand-new horse blanket, which I'd paid $6 for. It was now just 2 weeks before Christmas, and Daddy was making his trip to town for supplies. We'd put the robe on display in the window of the harness shop, which the owner had kindly given us permission to do for a commission. I don't know how we arrived at our price, but we decided to ask $80 for it. The shop owner put a price tag on it for $100, the difference to be his commission. I thought surely that anyone able to drive a Cadillac would want that robe, but to my great disappointment it didn't sell. It just hung in the window, collecting dust until March. At that time I made a trip into town to take the teacher in to attend Teachers' Institute. We had to dismiss school for a week so that she could go. Her folks came out after her in their car, and she had invited me to come in and spend the week with them, which gave me a splendid opportunity to sell my robe and buy a horse. I was leaving, Edson gave me a rousing whack on the back and said, "You can do it, Ma. Of course you can. You can do anything." The evening we arrived in town, I read in the paper that some horses were being sold from a ranch estate that was being settled. I knew the man who had the horses for sale on consignment, and right away I thought, there's my horse. Bill Williams had a big corral up on Riverside Drive. He had 25 horses corralled and for sale. I rose early the next morning and walked up to see Bill. No sooner had I entered the corral than I spied a 3-year-old brown Belgian mare. To my notion she was a beauty, just exactly what I wanted. From the very first my eyes were blinded to seeing any other animal. Bill was asking $65 for her, and I was asking $80 for the robe. I told him about the robe, and told him I wanted to trade with him the robe for the mare, and I wanted $15 to boot. We got in his jalopy and went after the robe. Then we dickered and dickered from Sunday morning till the next Saturday night. I was at the corral every day, but not trying to get any other horse. I would have the trade just about made when Bill's little 80-year-old mother would come out and say, "Now, Bill, don't sell that lady the horse." Bill would usher her back into the house none too kindly, and we would go on with our horse trading. The professional horse trader is the hardest man on earth to deal with. I know. Late Saturday evening I gave up and traded the robe straight across for the mare. Then I sat down and cried on the first stairway I came in on the way back to the house, thinking I'd been beaten out of $15. When we at last made the deal, his little old mother came out, put her arms around my neck, and said, I tried so hard to keep Bill from selling you that horse. It's the meanest thing ever came into the corral. Now the sale is made, I'm asking God to bless her and make her a good horse for you." Her blessing must have worked, for there was never a truer, better horse. She was unbroken at the time, but some friends of ours who lived near Reno wanted an extra horse to do their spring plowing, and I made arrangements with them to use my colt. They plowed with her for a month, and she was thoroughly broken. Daddy went to town, bought a new harness and tongue for the spring wagon, hitched the colt up with Johnny, and proudly drove the two horses home. That same summer I acquired a saddle horse in the most unexpected way. I had driven into town, and while I was there I heard of a man who wanted to buy our old transfer wagon that we had stored in Reno. This man, Mr. Murray, ran a dairy and hog ranch, and he wanted the transfer wagon to haul slop for the hogs. So I drove out to see him. Just as I pulled into his yard, he was hitching his team up to his milk delivery wagon. One of the horses was balking, and he was standing in the wagon, beating the horse with the butt end of the buggy whip and swearing till the very air turned blue. As he saw me, he halted the whip in mid-air, fairly glaring at me. I guess no one likes to be seen beating a dumb animal. I called out, "Mister, would you like to sell her?" I already had planned a trade in the back of my mind. "If you'll take the blankety-blank old bitch, I'll give her to you," he swore. "No," I told him, "I don't want you to give her to me, but I heard you wanted to buy an old transfer wagon that we own. I'll trade you the wagon for her." "Take her, lady, take her. I'll even throw in the headstall and the halter rope." He unhitched her, tied her behind my wagon, stopping long enough to make out a bill of sale for the horse, while I made out one for the wagon. I drove away feeling I'd made a wonderful trade. The horse was a brown thoroughbred mare, and I could visualize a long string of beautiful colts from our mare and the Morgan stallion that the P.F. Company owned. I knew I could get the cowboys to breed her for me for nothing. After I got a half-mile from Mary's dairy ranch, I got out of the wagon and went back to pet and get acquainted with my new animal. Her name was Kate. She had a lovely brown coat, but there were great cool welts all over her hips. I petted her and stroked her, promising she'd get no more beatings. I knew she balked, but we didn't intend to drive her. She was just to be a saddle horse and broodmare. She was heavy with foal when I got her, and she had been bred to a jack, so she bought us a nice mule colt. We called him Rastus. Nobody loved Rastus, for he kicked from the day he was born. We never had a fence he couldn't jump or a rope he couldn't break. Rastus was the only animal that had ever come on our place that wasn't loved. Lord, how I hated that mule. He followed his mother wherever we rode her, and when we were herding cattle, it seemed like it to be his great delight to jump in the middle of them and start braying and kicking. Once, when Rastus was about 3 years old, I had occasion to ride Kate into Reno. I tied Rastus to the manger in the corral with a 1-inch rope, and gave the children orders to feed and water him while I was gone, but by no means to let him out. When I was about halfway to town, I heard hee-haw, hee-haw, and here came Rastus, his head held to one side to keep from stepping on the rope, coming in at a high lope and braying every step. He had chewed the rope in two. Now I had a problem. What could I do with a loose mule? I couldn't take him through town running loose, for he might kick half a dozen of children on the way. I sat on Kate and puzzled. What will I do? That big question was always coming up in my life. I knew a rancher about a half-mile out of Sparks, so I decided to go in that way and ask him to take care of the mule for me. As I rode into the corral, he was sitting in a bench whittling. He looked up and said, "Where'd you get that beautiful mule?" "Raised him. You want to buy him?" "Nope, don't want to buy him myself, but I know a fella who does. He's had me looking out for some time for a mule to match one of his. Be a pretty good match, and it's one of the finest mules I'd ever seen." So we made arrangements for him to sell Rastus for me. "You sell him for whatever you can," I told him. "Take your commission out and give me the rest, and I'll be satisfied. In the meantime, put the mule and my mare in your barn while I go into town." I walked the half-mile to Sparks and caught a streetcar into Reno. When my business was finished 3 days later, I went back to get Kate. My friend had sold the mule and counted out $75 for me. I never knew or cared what his commission was. I guess there was nothing wrong with the mule, for he was a beautiful animal. It was just something wrong with us. We didn't understand mules. I was never so happy or proud over any other sale I'd ever made. Kate was a wonderful success as a broodmare, and our long string of colts materialized, but she was never a howling success as a saddle animal. It was fun to ride her along the trap line, though. If there was something in the trap, she would sense it from several hundred yards away and plainly demonstrate what tales horses' ears can tell. She would tell me as plain as any language if I had something in my traps. I couldn't get her within 100 yards of a trapped animal. When the animal's dead, she made no fuss about having it tied on her saddle, but she was afraid of a trapped wild animal. She had been raised in the Truckee meadows, where the traveling was smooth, and it was her nature to run, for it had been bred into her for generations. Out here she constantly encountered rocks and sagebrush, things she was entirely unfamiliar with. It's strange to note the difference between a hill-raised horse and a valley-raised horse. One that's been raised among rocks can run through them at top speed, but old Kate often stumbled and fell. When the sagebrush tickled her belly, she would jump straight into the air and simply go wild. One day, while Edson was riding around the mountain, he fell in with an Indian who was running wild horses. He took out after them on Kate. He came into a blind canyon where the rim rocks dropped abruptly. The trail ran around the head of the rim rocks, but Kate was determined to go straight across. Edson couldn't guide her, and when she was over the sheer drop, he jumped to safety. She fell about 20 feet, cutting her whole chest open. Edson and the Indian had to go 2 miles down the canyon and then back up to where she hung to rescue her. Then they led her down to Hardscrabble Ranch, where the Indian lived. Next day, Edson borrowed a horse from his friend and came home. He and I were talking it over quietly, trying to keep Daddy from hearing, for he was bedfast at the time and we didn't want to upset him. But just try to keep something that you don't want known from ears that want to hear. AJ heard us all right and called out, "If the kid's all right, then to hell with the horse, take the gun over and shoot her." We went into Daddy's bedroom to talk it over and decided if Kate wasn't able to walk home, Edson was to shoot her. Edson took a saddle horse of his own, leading the Indian's horse back. The next day, Kate was able to walk home, the worst cut-up animal, still alive, that I had ever seen. She had fallen on sharp rocks, making a jagged tear, exposing the great white breastbones. I decided to fix her. First, I put a twitch around her upper lip. A twitch is made of a piece of baling wire fastened onto a stick. You wrap the line around a horse's upper lip and have someone hold the stick. If the animal stands very still, the twitch is not painful, but if there's the least pull on it, it hurts the sensitive lip. Alice dearly loved horses, so she asked to help me by holding the twitch. As I went to work on the wound, the first little jerk Kate made, Alice fainted. We had to stop the operation and get her out of the corral. Then I went on alone. I had a large fountain syringe of the kind they use on horses. I filled it with boiled water that was disinfected with carbolic acid, tied the syringe to a post, and using the spray I washed out all the sand and gravel from the wound. Then I took a sterilized needle and white silk thread and sewed up the ragged edges of the skin. I dressed it every day for weeks. It healed rapidly. When it was completely well, there was never any sign of a scar on her beautiful satiny coat. I was surely proud of my second operation. The saddle that had gone over the bluff with Kate was almost a complete loss. We salvaged nothing from it but the stirrups and the latigo.
And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm.